This is the Advanced Entrepreneurship class. My name is James Stone. I'll be your instructor for this. Most of you have been in my classes before, and most of you have taken some classes that address some of the topics that we'll be talking about as we go through the class. So some things like marketing and finance, we'll be doing more of a survey of, and we'll also be doing some work with building out budgets and budgeted financial statements, and we'll start doing that next time. Today what we're going to talk about is strategic management. And who knows what strategic management is? Or can someone just give a rough definition of strategic management?
Is maybe developing a plan to guide a company to reach its goals, objectives?
Good. Okay, so it's developing a plan to help the company reach its goals and objectives. That's a good definition. And there are a lot of definitions. One is it's matching the opportunities and threats in the external environment with the strengths and weaknesses of a particular company or organization. So we'll be talking about how that works here shortly. And let's just look initially at the strategic management process as outlined in our textbook here. So first step, and we spoke about this last time, is develop a vision, translate it into a mission statement. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but what's a vision?
General idea.
It's a general idea for a company or an organization. And what's a mission statement?
It's your final goal.
It is kind of. Okay, so a mission statement generally will discuss what business you're in. It outlines what business you're in and some of the values of the business. And mission statements have a number of benefits. They help to coalesce people who work for the company and suppliers and other partners around the vision of the company. Some of us are familiar with lifestyle brands, and we have good feelings about those brands, right? So how many of you have a good feeling about Apple? Okay, a lot of people. How many of you have Apple products? Probably one way or the other, most of us. How about Harley Davidson? Anybody positive feelings about Harley Davidson? Yeah, it's surprising, but in my country, it's one of the few brands where people will, they'll tattoo the logo on their bodies. And I don't see Coca-Cola, or BMW, but it's not unusual to see Harley Davidson. And you see a lot of people walking around with Harley Davidson branded materials. And part of it was there was a vision behind Harley Davidson, and that's freedom, and that's individualism, rugged individualism, and like that. And that's part of the culture of the company, and it's part of the image of the brand. And a lot of people, I have friends that have Harleys, they love their motorcycles. It's different than the people that ride a Honda. Harley Davidson's mission statement begins with, "We fulfill dreams through the experiences of motorcycling by providing to motorcyclists and the general public an expanding line of motorcycles." And the mission statement goes on. So, they fulfill dreams. Rugged individualism, freedom, fulfillment of dreams. Okay, and we read the mission statement from Fetzer Wines last time. And so what it does is it says, this is a business we're in, these are the things that matter to us as a company. And that helps drive the business too, because let's say that your part of your mission statement is highest quality wines. That means you're not going to use poor quality grapes. Everybody knows that. If there's a batch of poor grapes, they don't go into the wine. You sell them to somebody else. Okay, so let's move on. Then you assess strengths and weaknesses. We talked about this a bit last time as well. What are strengths and weaknesses?
Internal factors of the company.
Internal factors of the company, and we're going to see this here shortly. And they're things that will help you either achieve your goals or they may interfere with you achieving goals and objectives. And then the step 3 is you scan the environment for opportunities and threats. So the environment, is that outside or inside the company? External factors outside of the company. And remember that when you're doing your SWOT analysis, if you're talking about strengths and weaknesses, you're talking about things within the company. If you're talking about opportunities and threats, you're looking externally. And we'll look at how that's done. And then identify key success factors for the industry So those are things that you can measure different competitors against, and also key success factors for your company, because there are certain things your company is going to need in order to be most successful in its competitive environment. So we mentioned strengths before, positive internal factors that contribute to accomplishing the mission, goals, and objectives. Name a company and name a strength.
Apple iOS.
Okay, iOS, definitely. Apple's iOS, its operating system, is definitely a strength. That's one of the principal reasons people buy iPhones, right? It's one of the underpinnings of the iPhone. There are other design issues, and also iPads, right? It differentiates that product. It's a strength, and we're going to look at the VRIO framework here, and we spoke about this last time. We'll see it again here shortly in looking at resources within the company to determine whether they give competitive advantage and what kind of competitive advantage they give. And I'm going to repeat things a few times throughout this class just to reinforce them. Because one of the things that we as people who study business and who are in business need to do is constantly be analyzing wherever we go, whenever we walk into a market. We want to look around and say, here's some strengths, here's some weaknesses, here's how I would do it differently. If they hired me as a consultant to help them improve their supermarket or to improve their consulting firm, these are the items that I would have on my list to talk to them about. And some of the stuff we're going to discuss today gives you a framework to analyze things from. Okay, and then weaknesses. What's a company that has weaknesses? Most companies have some weaknesses. Name a company and name some weaknesses. Anybody been to the Boar House? Now it's called, used to be the Boar House. It's a sports bar. It's called the Sports Bar, I think, over right across from the atrium. Anybody been there recently? Okay, well, one of their weaknesses, in my opinion, this is on camera, one of their weaknesses is the waitresses ignore you. So they could make a lot more money, they'd sell a lot more product if instead of ignoring people, they would either add a couple of waitresses or watch for people who are ready to reorder. Because there are many times I've been there and I've been willing to order more drinks, order more food, and eventually I just gave up. So they got about a third as much money as they would have gotten from me in an evening, me and my friends, 4 or 5 of us who were out. What are some big name companies that you think have some weaknesses?
What about Facebook? They still don't have web conferences, video conferences. Like their competitors, Google Plus,
okay.
They do have it.
Okay.
And Facebook still doesn't have it.
Okay,
I
so
think they're planning to. They're planning to work together with Skype.
Okay,
I think for this huge company that has 900 million subscribers, it's a huge weakness.
Okay.
To have the video conference.
So if you were to talk to them, you'd say, you're
100%.
behind on getting the video conferencing in.
100%.
Okay. And do you think people would switch from Facebook to other suppliers?
Google Plus has around 100 million now.
Okay,
so it's
good.
like potential 100 million people for Facebook, but they lost them.
Okay, or they're starting to
It
migrate.
was announced yesterday.
Okay. Good. I want to mention one of the people who has been a pioneer in developing business strategy has been Michael Porter. And 3 of the tools that we're going to be looking at today are the corporate value chain, the Porter's 5 forces, the competitive forces that help determine the attractiveness of an industry, and also 3 generic strategies, which you should have run into actually in previous classes. Businesses exist to create value and to receive something of value in return. So what's value from the standpoint of a business? If I'm creating a business, value is what customers will willingly pay for, right? Excuse me? A product, but a product is something. If you think of the product just as a product, sometimes what you're thinking too small. So let's think about smartphones, right? What's that a picture of up there?
iPad.
An iPad. Okay, I had, years before the iPad was released, I had a Hewlett-Packard notebook computer that had tablet characteristics. I could turn it over, lay it flat with the screen face up. I could draw on the screen, do a lot of things with it. And I spent, I don't know, $800 or $900 for it. It was okay, but it didn't sell like the iPad. Were there tablets out before the iPad?
I think they were.
Yeah, there were some devices. Okay, okay.
Mobile computer.
Okay, but what happened was they found, Apple always does this, at least in recent years, they find a way of adding value, so they'll bring in people, they're early adopters to new technologies that will buy things. But what Apple's been good at is taking sort of a relatively new technology or a technology that hasn't caught on in a big way and turning it into something that's just mass market where everybody wants it. Does that make sense? iPhones, smartphones. A lot of people who would have gone with just the simple phones, they switched to smartphones because there was value added for them as a result of all these features that were on an iPhone, right? And a lot of the competitors were blown out of the water because they thought of a product. Okay, we'll give them a phone, we'll give them the stuff that used to be on the personal digital assistants, we'll give them a few features. Apple went way beyond that, and the basis for that was iOS and smart people thinking about things. Michael Porter, as an academic, decided to look at what companies do, what activities they engage in that add value, things that the customers are willing to pay for, and the activities the company engages in that are support for making sure that these activities that add value can exist. Now it sounds kind of theoretical, but it makes sense when you think about it. People are willing to pay for, let's say you could be a retailer or a manufacturer. People are willing to pay for you to get the materials you need to manufacture something, right? So they're willing to pay for inbound logistics. They're willing to pay for manufacturing the product. They're happy to pay for that. Or for refining the oil and creating new products. They're willing to pay for you to ship something out. They're willing to pay for marketing and sales because that helps build the brands, and we'll talk about that. And they're also willing to pay for service. They're happy to build that in. But if you're spending a lot of extra money on transactions to procure things, they're not so happy about that if that drives up the price. And what happens if your price gets too high and it's a product that other people can produce?
Nobody buys.
Either people buy less or competitors come in and they say, hey, I can procure, I can manage this process cheaper than anybody else. And also, I can reduce the cost of the primary activities. That's Dell Computer. Where did Dell Computer start? It was in a dormitory. Yeah, Michael Dell was in college, and what he did was he would take orders for computers to build computers, and he'd take the money, and then he would, at least this is the mythology, he would take the money, he had the money before he actually had people build the computers, and then he would ship them. So he didn't have a lot of inventory and other things. So what Dell Computer has a very lean value chain, and they've been able to reduce the costs of some of the support activities. They've also reduced the costs of the primary activities for them. And that's why I could buy a Dell computer for about $800 less than I could buy any other computer the last time I bought a Dell, the only time I bought a Dell, at that time when I was visiting California. I think that was 2007. Exact same components, but it was $792 less than from any other vendor that I could find when I was in Silicon Valley. Okay, one of the things that's important here is marketing and sales, and this is one of the things that gets overlooked often in Russia. For some reason, a lot of Russian companies don't think advertising and other marketing activities really matter, and they don't seem all that willing to put a lot of money into them.
They don't know how to do it.
That's part of it, and so that's an opportunity for a lot of you in here in the future, right? But they have to be convinced that it matters, but marketing does add value. These are some brands that are really, really good at marketing. And we see a couple of lifestyle brands, brands that say something about you as a person when you use their products. Apple is considered a lifestyle brand. Harley Davidson is considered a lifestyle brand. Starbucks, maybe to some extent, excuse me? Nike, yeah, Nike, okay, I didn't have them on here, I just found a few. Hugo Boss, it says something. You wear a Hugo Boss suit, it says something about you, right? So one of the things that's a purpose for value chain analysis, or a few of the things, are first of all, determining where you actually add value to customers. And one of the things we'll talk about in the future is controls, and looking at how much you're spending to do certain activities. And that's important, particularly with the new WTO world that Russia's about to enter. But ensuring that you're actually adding value for customers and other stakeholders. Who are other stakeholders for a company?
Everybody who's involved in
The investors?
Yeah, everybody who's involved. So it can be the investors, their stockholders and stakeholders or shareholders. Okay, it can be the local community, it's customers, it's workers, it's a lot of people. It's people who are affected by their success because it might determine whether there's going to be there will be other businesses that are effective in the community. Another part of it is eliminating unnecessary activities. Now this is something, there's going to be a lot of this in companies in Russia coming up. Historically, and you can talk to some of my colleagues here who work with human resources, and they'll tell you a lot of these companies are saying that, yeah, you know, we've got people, we've filled the slots, but we're really not getting much done with the people, right? They're not all that productive. So a lot of companies in the new WTO world for Russia are going to start looking at what activities are unnecessary. They're going to start walking through all the processes of the company. And so that's one of the things you can be thinking about as you're doing value chain analysis for your company ideas, but also as you're looking at your own company and other companies, right? Okay, and then reducing costs, very important. We talked about this a bit last time, and this is the VRIO framework. It's considered a resource-based approach to looking at the company's strengths, principally strengths, right? And so what you do is you look at resources that the company has, and it can be certain departments, it can be patents, copyrights, it can be the CEO. It can be a chief information officer, it can be any number of things. And what you do is you look at a lot of these different resources that are important to the company, and you determine, first of all, are they valuable? If they're not valuable, then they're a disadvantage because you've got a resource that has no value. What are you doing with that? Make sense? If it is valuable, but it's not rare, then you've got a resource that gives you parity with competitors. Parity means sameness, right? Equality. Okay, I mentioned an example last time. What was that? And we talked about parity. America, a hamburger stand, right? Now, I could go out and start a hamburger stand. I could sell hamburgers. Is that valuable? Yeah, will customers pay for it? Yes, but is it rare? No. I mentioned McDonald's, a Big Mac. Is that valuable? Yeah, they sell billions of them. Is it rare?
Yes.
Yeah, it's protected by patents, right? And so people go there, they're jonesing for a McDonald's hamburger. How many of you like McDonald's French fries? Anybody? A lot of people in America, they love McDonald's French fries. Those are patented, right? Those are valuable, they're rare. There are people that are walking along and they start, we say jonesing, you know, they're feeling like, I need some McDonald's French fries. Now, I'm not real big on that kind of food, particularly as I get older, but a lot of people are. How about Coca-Cola? Their formula. A lot of people, I can't tell the difference. Cola's cola to me. But for a die-hard Coca-Cola or Pepsi drinker, there's clear difference. So they've got a valuable, you know, bit of sugar water, and it's rare because it's protected. Sometimes there's a company that has, well, I invested in a company, Pretium Resources, because they have a CEO who was really good, who built up another mining company, Agnico Eagle Mining, and he built it up to being a very strong company and then split off and took some resources with him. And so I invested at the suggestion of somebody who I really respect in that company principally, and so did a lot of people, principally because of the CEO, because it looked like this is a person who can manage a mining company and make money. Okay, moving on. Then let's say it's valuable and rare, but it's not costly to imitate. What did I use as an example last time for that?
Apple.
Actually, I think I used for that Sony Walkman,
Oh,
remember? Okay, so Sony came out initially with the Walkman, and this is an example from the textbooks. They had the Walkman. Was it pretty easy to imitate that?
very easy.
Was there anything really proprietary about it other than the brand?
No.
Nah, So you could go to the bank and open a bank account and they'd give you a Sony Walkman looking device and you'd call it a Sony Walkman, but it wasn't, it didn't say Sony on it. And so there were a lot of other companies that could come in with a similar device, right? So it was easy to imitate, but some people still paid more and they bought Sony. And we'll talk about differentiation strategy a bit later. Okay, so it has temporary advantage. Sony eventually had to lower its prices some for the device because there were other devices and people started getting price sensitive about buying a portable tape recorder. Okay, and then finally, if it's valuable, rare, and costly to imitate, and you are organized to take advantage of it, an iPad, a Harley Davidson, right? The design of the motorcycles, then those are, and the brand and a variety of other things, then those are things that can give you sustained competitive advantage. Does that make sense? Okay. So one of the things you want to look at is what do the competitors have as you're looking into your business? Do they have anything that gives them, do their resources give them sustained competitive advantage? And are there any things about your perspective company that could give your company sustained competitive advantage? Okay, let's talk about the next step, which is, this was internal analysis looking at strengths and weaknesses, evaluating resources, value chain analysis for the corporate value chain. Let's talk about external analysis. And we talked about external analysis helping us to determine what the opportunities and threats are. It also helps to determine if there are above normal profits likely in an industry that you might enter, or if you're already in the industry, whether you should stay. What industry did IBM get out of in the last several years? It's one they helped build up. Anybody remember?
Emergency office.
That I'm not sure of, but I was thinking personal computers. They sold off their ThinkPad line to Lenovo, and as far as I know, they sold off their whole personal computer line to Lenovo. And they got out of that business. They still do servers and other types of higher end computers, but they decided that there was so much competition that the margins were too low. So they didn't want to compete there. They thought they could make better margins in other businesses, including consulting, design of whole systems, and servers and that kind of stuff. Okay, so it helps you to see if there are above normal profits likely in an industry. It also helps you to understand the competition in the industry. What's it like? And are you going to be able to survive that competition? Are there threats and are there opportunities? And also, you can make better choices strategically. Now, we talked last time also about the industry value chain. Remember that?
Yeah.
Okay, and what's the idea of the industry value chain?
If you can give a proposal to the potential client, actually, not start from the very beginning of the chain, but in case if you have some features, you can sell your product directly to the final client.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, so you might look at some steps that you can cut out of the value chain. And the industry value chain is the set of value-adding activities that make up an industry. And I've only seen a couple of these industry value chains, and I've mentioned last time, I've tried to look for more. It seems like you've got to pay a lot of money to get them, and I'm not sure what I'd be getting. So most of our students, when they're doing their diploma papers, they estimate or they try to determine what the industry value chain is for their particular business, and I usually give them some advice too. But notice here, for the petroleum industry, it starts with exploring for crude oil. Now most of us don't want to go doing that, right? We're going to pay somebody else to do that. We're going to pay somebody else to drill for the crude oil. We're going to also pay somebody else to pump it, ship it, buy it, refine it, sell the refined products to distributors, and ship the refined products. We're down here at the retail end, most of us, right? Now there are some companies that are fully integrated. They do all of this stuff, right? And there are some companies that just do one part of it. There are companies that buy crude oil and resell it, just like there are companies that buy energy and resell it. They're middle people. That was Enron. Enron was an energy purchaser. They started out as a natural gas company, but they were a middle person. So in some cases, there are still small companies that are just buying or refining crude oil. As you look at your business, you want to know where you want to know the whole value chain for your industry, but you also want to know what steps in the value chain your industry is competing in. And you may be competing against giants who are fully integrated, or you may be competing principally against people, you may be a niche player, right? Principally competing with people at the same level. You know, there might be other companies. Now, one of the things about a value chain, too, is it tells who the suppliers are and who the customers are. So if I'm pumping crude oil, my suppliers might be people drilling, right? They come, they drill, and then I set up my pumps. And my customers are going to be people who are buyers of crude oil if I'm a small operator. Now, this is a pretty consolidated industry. Okay, so you want to understand the value chain for your company. You want to understand who the customers are and also who the suppliers are. Okay, and here's another value chain, an industry value chain for a product-oriented organization. And it also starts with crude oil. But here, notice there's another concept. Here they manufacture plastic kitchenware, then it goes through wholesalers, there's packaging, there are retailers, and then there are the final customers. So notice here at manufacturing, there's a break here, and you'll hear companies or you'll hear business people talking about upstream and downstream. And upstream, generally, you're talking about upstream closer to raw materials, and downstream, you're talking about closer to the final consumers. So those are concepts that you often hear, upstream and downstream, and you're thinking, what are they talking about? Well, now you know. Okay, so simply put, the top of the value chain for many industries is raw materials. Middle of the value chain is manufacturing. After manufacturing, there's often historically been distribution. And the benefit of distribution, you discussed this in marketing, remember? Okay, the benefit of distribution is if I'm a manufacturer and I've got to talk to every customer who's going to buy the finished product, that's a lot of contacts. And if I'm a manufacturer, maybe I'm not good at that stuff. What I'm good at is manufacturing, right? I'm not good at making the contacts. A distributor, on the other hand, can can reduce by at least a third the number of contacts that are having to be made in order to get that same number of customers. And if those customers are dozens or thousands of other distributors or of retailers or something, then it makes a big difference. But technology's changed that, hasn't it? And we'll see that in just a minute. Okay, so here are some distribution channel schemes. You might have seen this in marketing as well. Remember, there are the direct channels. Manufacturer go to direct to the customer. And there are a number of companies that do this, particularly with B2B type companies. Okay, then there's an indirect channel from manufacturer to retailer to the consumers. And some of the big retailers have tried to develop this system. They've been very successful at this. So they've eliminated the middle person, the wholesaler, right? Okay, and so the third one, another model is manufacturer to wholesaler to retailer to consumer, and then finally manufacturer to wholesaler to jobber. And a jobber is usually somebody who's a smaller, they have smaller clients. So it might be somebody here, a jobber might be a distributor who puts together packages of supplies, of inventory rather, for kiosks, right? So instead of packaging it for large supermarkets, what they do is they package it for kiosks, or they package it for small manufacturers if you're using manufacturing goods. Okay. And then at the bottom of the value chain, of course, the retailers. And we see British Petroleum. They have stations here, do they not? Did somebody
Yeah.
say they have? Okay, and I haven't seen one that I recall. Okay, and then Walmart. Walmart has been the king of retail. Now, retail is changing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Here's an example, and I mentioned this last time too. When I was a kid, you know, buying Pink Floyd and Emerson, Lake and Palmer albums and like that, Grateful Dead, I was going to Tower Records much of the time. And they were everywhere. And you know, you go in, it was sort of a scene. You go in, you hang out, you look at all this music, some of it's really cheap, and they had records originally, and then tapes and then CDs and like that. What happened?
Technology's changed.
Technology changed. Initially, Napster, right? Remember Napster? File sharing? Okay, so basically what happened was all this music, this protected property, this intellectual property was being freely distributed. So somebody had to come in and make sure that the record labels could still make money and the artists could still make money off their product, right? And so that was iTunes, and who is that? Apple. And what was Apple called before?
Apple computer.
Apple Computer. And what did Apple do? What was their principal thing? Computers. And yet, they were the ones that came up with the idea to do an online store to sell music, to package music, to sell one song at a time. Now, who else could have done this if they'd been really scanning the environment and looking at the opportunities? Well, Tower Records could have done it, right? But they just gave their whole business away and went bankrupt. Who else could have done it? How about the record labels? Why didn't they just do a mutual services consortium, all get together and agree to put their money into investing in a company that would do exactly this? So one of the things a lot of suppliers and customers of Apple, the business customers don't like about Apple, at least in the papers, you know, in the press, is they say that Apple squeezes all the money they can out of all their products. So the record labels aren't all that happy about 99 cents a song price, since they're only getting a small share, and I honestly don't remember how much it is. But it wasn't that great for them, but it was a lot better than Napster, right? But this is something, if they'd been smart, if they'd had people working for them, then they might have said, let's Sony and Capitol and some of these other records companies, they might have gotten together and just set up their own store, right? And sold direct. These opportunities were out there, but now what's the point? What's the point in competing with this? What else did Apple do that was smart with iTunes?
App Store.
Okay, they've got an app store now. The other thing they did, when I became familiar with iTunes, principally because I got an iPod. And so my iPod it's one of the first, it's either the first or second year, and I've got 30-some days of lectures and music and other stuff on it. You know, it's great. But I use iTunes to synchronize with it, and I use it for listening to music and some other things as well. Anyway, the point was retail's changing. So what we're seeing is what's called disintermediation. A lot of the middle people are being removed. And so if you're going to be a middle person, if you're going to be a wholesaler or even a retailer now, you have to add some value for the customers. So, new economy, new value chains, fewer levels in the value chains, fewer companies, and a big focus on corporate value chains, reducing costs, reducing unnecessary activities. Okay, we talked a bit last time about environmental scanning. Remember PEST? What does that stand for?
Political, economic, social, and economic.
Okay, political issues that might affect an industry, economic issues that might affect an industry, socio-cultural industries, and there are different ways of saying this, and technological factors that might affect an industry. We saw some technological factors earlier. Those were also impacted by some sociological factors, right? iTunes could exist because people were buying computers and iPods. The record industry would have had no problem if nobody had computers, right? But suddenly people had computers. They were also going on the internet. And I got on, personally on the internet in 1995. And I was not an early, there were people before me, but I was sort of on the big wave going in. My mom was on by I don't know, by 1999 or something, 1998, she had her own computer. Okay. So here are a few of the things, and this is in your syllabus as well, but some of the factors that you're looking at. Economic factors. Now, these are just some generic ones. What are some things that are happening economically and politically in the world right now? Tell me some political things that are happening that could have a big impact on Russian markets. How about WTO? That's political. Will that have an impact? Yeah. What are some of the impacts that can have?
Unpredictable, unfortunately.
The president election, like in France. The
Well,
president election.
That's another political thing, but let's just talk about WTO, accession to WTO. What are some obvious things that are probably going to happen?
Reduce of the price for the imported goods.
Reducing the price of imported goods, which means people may buy more foreign goods, which may or may not be a good thing. Now, if you can be a distributor of those and not be cut out, then maybe that's a good thing. But if it's possible to buy foreign goods relatively direct, then maybe that's not a good thing, right? If you can cut out some of those layers because there's not that much money, there's not that much added value that's being paid to people in Russia, right? Okay, what are some other things that are going to happen, do you think? It's going to affect the competitive environment here. Okay, let's go further. Yeah, a lot more competition from some companies that have been working in the West. Are they pretty good at what they do? A lot of these Western companies? Yeah. And if they're getting easier access to the Russian labor market and to Russian consumer markets and business markets, does that make it more difficult, conceivably, for Russian businesses to compete? Yeah, it can. And the other thing that's happening also is that there's consolidation in industries. So more and more companies, there are more mergers and acquisitions, and there are also companies that are just falling off, right? Okay, how about economically? What are some things? Well, let's talk about politics some more, and this is sort of socio-cultural and economic. What's going on in Greece? They've had a crisis. They're on the verge of default. They just had an election. They couldn't form a government. They're going to have another election. A lot of the left and right parties that are not going along with giving the bankers back the money that was borrowed, that was created, you know, at the time it was borrowed. It didn't exist before, but for the most part. But the bankers want it back with interest, right? But what are a lot of the citizens saying? No. And a lot of the citizens aren't willing to pay their taxes anymore, so there have been uprising. That's the uprisings. That's sort of socio-cultural and political, right? Now, what are some things that can happen as a result of that? What are they talking about?
They will go out from Eurozone.
They may go out from the Eurozone. What are some other countries that may follow them or relatively close behind?
Italy and Spain.
Italy, Spain, Portugal.
Portugal.
And Ireland, maybe. Ireland's apparently a little more stable. Okay, Belgium, I've read, isn't doing so great. So those are some things you'd want to keep an eye on, right? If you're doing analysis for your business looking at the future, how could that affect Russia? Let's say 3 or 4 countries leave the Eurozone. What could happen to the euro?
It will really affect it because of the decrease for the oil prices. You know, because of unpredictable situation in Europe, there is always a decrease in demand for the oil, and this was the direct reaction of the Russian market to these events in the Greece.
Okay, good. So already the Greek crisis and the crisis in the pig nations, which are the Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain, that's already impacted the demand for oil from Russia.
Yeah, and in addition to it, as a second step, all Russian blue chips went down.
Okay. Yeah, and we're seeing, you know, things I'm invested in aren't looking so good now. The stock market's going down. That means I have less wealth, right? And gold and silver, I'm invested in that. That means I have less wealth, at least on paper. I haven't sold it, so, you know, you don't realize it. But that affects me. And that affects a lot of other people. The dollar's gone up a bit against the euro. The dollar's gone up again a bit, at least I haven't looked for a few weeks, but it's gone up a little bit against the ruble as well. Because apparently, for some bizarre reason, people are buying dollars. They're leaving, I guess, the euro, or at least that's what we would be led to believe. Okay, so those are some political things that might affect this market. And if you're going to start some businesses, what you may want to do is look at starting businesses that are going to be purchased by other Western businesses that are going to come into this market. Who was a restaurant holding company that did that here in Russia?
KFC.
Yeah, KFC, which was Raw Center, right? Raw Center, they did Raw Sticks, and it was quite successful. I don't think I was ever at a Raw Sticks where I didn't wait in line. And they were quite successful, and they were able to sell it to KFC. They tried to get a deal with KFC, what, 15 years ago, and KFC wasn't interested? Well, they bought them. And sometimes that's what you do. You build the business to sell it to somebody else. I often thought that's what Shokoladnitsa was probably trying to do with Starbucks, because they bought up all these good locations, which was typically what Starbucks would do. So I thought maybe they were trying to get bought. It doesn't appear. Okay, then there are sociocultural things. What are some, how about in the food industry? What are some things that are happening here related to food? Well, one thing is, excuse me? Sushi, yeah, that's a big thing. And actually, it's gone down some, but there was just a boom in sushi restaurants. And I used to go to some of the few sushi restaurants here, and we'd have to wait in line to get in. You know, now it's not so much since the crisis, and I think people are concerned about contamination and stuff. But yeah, sushi was real big. Another thing I've noticed is Russians are buying a lot of packaged Western-style stuff. A lot of potato chips and a lot of stuff, and I like the taste of that stuff too, but it's probably not all that healthy, you know? Yeah. Russians are buying more fast food. So really, Russian people used to eat more raw foods, and the milk would come in and it was fresh that day. I don't even think it was pasteurized when they had it in the big containers. Okay, and I know some Russian people who were starting to go back to that. They're saying, I don't want this stuff anymore. I don't want the heart disease. I don't want the diabetes. I don't want all this other stuff. So I want to go back to some, you know, I want to start drinking raw milk and eat sheep's cheese. And
Are you speaking about the supermarket, right?
yes, and I love that market. I'm a regular. But I see a lot of Russian people in there. It's a very popular market. And so that's something that's new. They're not just doing pedicaustic. That's going on in America too. A lot of Americans want organic food. We don't want genetically modified foods, right? And so, in fact, there's an initiative going on the ballot in California to make it necessary to label genetically modified foods. Russians, for the most part, don't want genetically modified foods. Those are some sociocultural trends. So what you want to do as you're developing your business idea and examining the industry, you want to look at not just these factors, these are just some generic things, but you want to find the things that are going to affect your industry that might give some opportunities and threats to the industry. And sometimes a threat to the industry, it could be a political threat to the industry that may be a benefit for one company. It may be an opportunity for one company. That happens a lot. Another innovation of Michael Porter's was to recognize the competitive forces. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but there are competitive forces that determine whether above normal profits can be realized in a particular industry. And so it's very important to look at the industry. And you see a diagram here, and you've got this diagram and some more explanation there in your syllabi. But the first is threat of new entrants. And if there are low barriers to entry, then it's easy for new companies to come in. And often what they'll do is they'll undercut price-wise. And so pretty soon there are price wars and you're whittling away the margins, right? And some of the barriers to entry, things that make it difficult to enter, are economies of scale. It's very difficult to start a car company now. It's very difficult to start an oil company now because the big guys, it costs them so much less to produce each unit of activity, right? Everybody knows economies of scale. Okay, product differentiation. Would anybody want to start a new tablet company right now? Would you want to start an Android tablet company? Set it up, Yuri's Androids? No, I wouldn't. Why?
There is no space in this
One
niche.
product. Excuse me?
There is no niche. There is no space in this niche.
Yeah, there's no space. Who's dominating? Apple, so the iPad is dominating by far, and for other people who are buying others, there are established companies already in there doing it. They already have the economies of scale. They also have differentiated products because they've developed a brand. So unless you have a groundbreaking new technology that you're going to bring in with your tablet, there's no point in entering the industry. Okay, capital requirements, if it costs a lot to enter, then that can keep people out. Government policy keeps companies out. That's been a problem. A lot of Western companies complain that they can't get into this market effectively because of government policy, right? But sometimes that can be an opportunity for others, right? If there are barriers to entry for competitors, then that means less effective competitors or less effective businesses can thrive. And that happens, and that's called protectionism, and it's been good for the economy. Another force, competitive force, is threat of substitutes. Substitutes fill the same need, but they're not from the same industry. So they give an example here. Coke and Pepsi are rivals. Milk is a substitute.
Beer
Beer can be a substitute. A lot of things are substitutes. You know, water's a substitute, and that's why Coke and Pepsi got into selling water, and virtually every beverage, non-alcoholic beverage, they could get. Substitutes create a price ceiling because let's say you sell sugar, you produce sugar, and you want to raise your price. There's a point at which people will switch from sugar to high fructose corn syrup or to some other sweetener. So that puts a ceiling on the price that you can charge for sugar. And it also usually comes out from outside the industry. So if you're thinking about substitutes. So a substitute for the cruise ship industry is maybe camping or Disneyland or, you know, a vacation somewhere else. Could be a movie. Another competitive force is bargaining power of buyers. And if a buyer's powerful, if they purchase lots of the products from their suppliers. So Walmart can push down their cost for products from Procter & Gamble and others because they buy in large volume, right? They have power. And they can determine whether products will even be on the shelves. And what they've been able to do is get a lot of people to come to their big box stores. And so you want to be in Walmart if you're manufacturing most things, right? Okay. If they can integrate backwards, then they have power. What does it mean to integrate backwards? You see the value chain in your syllabus there?
Well, for example, if you just sell oil, you can go back and grill.
Exactly.
And,
Precisely. So if your customer can start doing your business too and cut you out, then they've got power. So you need to keep them happy. Okay, and you can read some more of these. If it doesn't cost much to change suppliers, then they've got power. They can start playing suppliers off against each other and getting the best deal. You see that, I've seen that in consulting, where we were battling with other consulting groups and we started lowering our prices, and pretty soon, actually what they did in one case was gave their friend, who was a solo person, the same rate they would have had to pay KPMG, which has all this overhead, so he was real happy. Okay. And if the buyer earns low profits, if they don't have much margin, then they have power because they'll just stop buying from you if you raise your price. Okay, kind of the opposite of that is bargaining power of suppliers, and it's high if there are just a few companies but they sell to a lot of people. So they can have consortiums and they can control the price. Well, OPEC is a good example of that, right? So they're a cartel that controls the price of oil because there are a few suppliers, and so if you want to buy, you're going to buy from them, and they also control a lot of the markets. Okay. And then the next thing to consider is threat of rivalry. Rivals are companies that are battling for the same customers. And what often happens in a new industry, in an emerging industry, is that a lot of companies come into it and they start fighting for niches. And that's okay, but then in order to make a lot of money, they have to build up their capacity to sell more product. It's normal. So they need to start encroaching on other niches and grabbing more segments. And so if you've got a lot of companies in the business, often they're having to go after each other's customers. So rivalry has to do with going head to head for the same customers. If you're selling a similar product, particularly a commodity, and you go head to head with the same customers, what happens to the price you're charging them? Usually goes down, right? Because three of us are trying to supply you. And so we're willing to negotiate on price, and pretty soon those above normal profits are squeezed out of the industry. Okay, if there are high fixed costs, there's a lot of money put into plant and offices and all that, then you want to make sure that you're at least still paying for that, so you're willing to lower your price to keep people busy. I want to just cover about 10 more minutes. Is that okay? Okay. So the next steps are in the strategic management process include analyzing the competition, creating goals and objectives, formulating strategy, translating plans into actions, and establishing accurate controls. And we talked about this a bit last time. Remember, we talked about looking at key success factors in the industry? And this is an example of a weighted table. There are some key success factors that are being considered. And then there are weights being given to each of them, because different factors have different importance. So the importance is reflected with a weight. And so quality is weighted as 25%, customer retention, holding on to customers, is 20%, location is 15%. Remember last time we talked about criteria? So you develop some criteria for measuring those that you can measure all the competitors against. And then here, here's your business, you get a rating, it's 1 to 5. 4 is pretty good, or maybe it's 1 to 4. Usually 1 to 5 is good because 3 is a middle value. Okay, so 4 for you, and then you multiply the weight times the rating, and that gives you the score. And then what you do is add up the scores, and that gives you the weighted score overall. So competitor 1, they don't do so well against your company. You're 3.6, they're 1.95. Competitor 2, however, is kind of taking up the rear, right? Now often you'll see something similar to this in a business plan. Sometimes they don't necessarily have weights, they just look at different products, services, sales potential, specific resources that they have. Okay? Then you also create company goals and objectives. Goals and objectives are seen as different often, particularly when you're speaking in business. Some people use them interchangeably, even in the States, but often you think of goals as being broad. We want to be profitable within a year. Objectives are more specific. And so we want to show 10% net profit by the end of the first fiscal year. So you can look back and you can say, did we do that or didn't we? There's a time frame on it. In fact, it's smart, it's specific, it's measurable, it's assignable, it's realistic, yet challenging, because if you make silly objectives, then it's meaningless. Everybody knows they're not going to happen. And then finally, it's timely. You can see either it was accomplished on time or it was not. So you set some objectives, then you need to determine how you're going to make them happen. And that's strategy. So you develop a plan for how to make it happen. And strategy is the roadmap. It says here, this is the way we're going to accomplish those objectives. You've already determined the mission, goals, and objectives. Those are the end. Strategy is how you're going to get there. And there are a lot of ways to accomplish certain things, right? So if you want to be more profitable, what are some things you can do to be more profitable or to be profitable? You can sell more, increase prices, you can cut costs, right? There are a lot of things. So there are a lot of parts of the value chain that can be affected, a lot of strategies at different levels of the value chain, different elements of the value chain that can determine whether you're going to meet that objective. Michael Porter also came up with 3 basic strategies, and you saw these in marketing, did you not? Remember that? Cost leadership, differentiation and focus, and this has to do with the competitive scope. Okay, differentiation and low cost or cost leadership strategies tend to be mass market. The focus strategy is more narrow segments, so you choose segments or niches. So it might be that you don't want to go big in the software industry. What you want to do is you want to focus on software for managing Chinese restaurants. And if you're in America, there are Chinese restaurants all over the country. So you can target that niche with specialized software that they'll pay a little more than they'll pay for QuickBooks or something. And it's designed specifically to manage their whole business. But it's something IBM's not going to bother with. Cost leadership, you want to be the low-cost producer of whatever product or service you're doing. And if buyers are sensitive to prices, that can be really important. So in the United States, for example, in retail, the cost leader is Walmart. And they've been really good at shaving the costs of doing business off. They handle their own distribution. They were the first to implement the barcodes. In fact, that drove other companies to do it. They're big on radio frequency ID technology now, so that cuts costs. Now you don't even need to walk in with the scanner. You can have a reader in a room and it can tell you all the inventory you have in the room. You don't need a person. Okay? And you can automate everything for that matter. The other thing they have is cheap labor. They've had some lawsuits about that. And so they've been very successful at that, particularly when compared with some of the unionized supermarkets and companies like that. Others, Toyota is the cost leader that you read about for the automobile industry. Now, they also are a brand that people will pay more for a Lexus or for a Camry, but they can produce a car at the same level as another competitor for less money per unit. Differentiation, iPhone, Apple with the iPhone, the iPad, Bentley, Jaguar, right? People buy the product, they're willing to pay more for it. They identify with the product. And sometimes you can have a combination of both. Some argue that McDonald's is both cost leadership and differentiation. Clearly, they're the cost leader when it comes to delivering food products in that price range. They can do it cheaper than anyone. But at the same time, some people think that their products are differentiated. They'll pay for a McDonald's hamburger or a Big Mac. Okay, and then focus strategies. You select a niche, you select a segment or a few segments, and you focus on them. So it might be, instead of being a clothier for women in general, you're a clothier for college-age women who are hipsters, or professional women going into their first jobs. Or you make paint products for certain elements of the population, and you sell them, and so you're targeting maybe people, more upscale people who are doing remodels in their homes. Okay, and then finally, you have to turn the strategies into action plans. So you've decided you've got a particular strategy, and you've determined that you want to accomplish certain objectives. That's the purpose of the strategy. Then you have to put together action plans. And those are going to affect every unit, every part of the value chain in your company. Each unit is going to have their own action plan, and they're going to have a purpose for what they're trying to accomplish. They're going to have a scope. What do I mean by scope? It's the scale, it's the breadth of what they're going to do. So there's some parameters for it. There's also, you need to know who's contributing what money's going in, how many people are going to be involved, what materials are needed, what connections with suppliers and others are going to be needed, what outside partners are going to be needed, who's contributing, what are the resources, and then the timing, when will things occur. So Nike a few years ago hired one of our graduates to implement a program to sell more soccer balls, headbands, wristbands, and socks. And so they put together a program, and they had a program plan for this. And what they wanted was for the big sports shops to put up displays, and they gave bonuses to the salespeople, and the top salesperson got a free trip to a sporting event somewhere in some other part of the world. I don't remember what it was. they also were setting up agreements with ambassadors at high schools. So there were people who, were people who liked Nike products already, and so they were people who would be promoting Nike in effect at the high schools. Real smart. And they timed it for back to school, but they had to back up from back to school and have enough lead time, a year in advance to make sure that that program was executed well. And I walked into Sportsmaster and they were doing it, Okay, and finally, establish controls. So you need to evaluate how you're doing. It's important to have some milestones along the way, things that you expect to accomplish, so you're not waiting for the whole year, the whole program to end, but you should expect certain activities to be accomplished in certain time frames, certain states of being to exist in certain time frames. And if they don't exist, then you need to adjust. And so what you're doing is you identify and track key performance indicators, KPIs, to see how you're doing. And then if you need to, you take corrective action. Sometimes you were measuring the wrong things. Sometimes you were too ambitious or not ambitious enough. And sometimes you need to address the human beings who were involved in some of the processes. So that overall is the strategic management process. Any questions? Okay, thank you. We'll take a break now, and if